"Sign the papers, you pathetic little nobody!" Daniel Whitmore ripped the wedding ring off Emily's finger and hurled it across the courtroom, then shoved the divorce papers into her chest hard enough to knock her back a step. 12 years of dragging you around like a corpse. You get the apartment and a check, and you should thank me for that. Rachel laughed from the back row. Emily didn't cry. She smoothed her coat, picked up the pen, and signed her name in silence. And Daniel, drunk on his own cruelty, never once looked out the window where a billionaire's black jet already sat on the runway, waiting to carry his worthless wife home to a fortune that could erase him. If a story about betrayal, patience, and a quiet woman everyone underestimated moves, you take 1 second to subscribe and follow Emily's journey to the very end. And leave a comment telling me the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The pen didn't shake in Emily Carter's hand. That was the first thing that bothered Daniel Whitmore, though he couldn't have explained why. He had walked into courtroom 4A that morning expecting a scene. He had prepared for it, actually. He had rehearsed the calm, understanding face he would wear while his wife of 12 years fell apart in front of the judge. He had imagined the tears, the trembling voice, the last desperate plea. And a part of him, a part he would never admit to anyone, had looked forward to it. But Emily just signed her name. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, small and neat and unhurried, and then she set the pen down and folded her hands in her lap and waited. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't look at Rachel Monroe, who was sitting 3 rows back in a dress that cost more than the settlement Daniel was offering. Emily looked at the window at the gray Boston light coming through the blinds, and she waited for the clerk to stamp the papers. "That's it," Daniel said. His own lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Preston, who charged $400 an hour, put a hand on Daniel's arm. It was a warning, don't push. But Daniel had never in his life been able to resist pushing. "You don't have anything to say." Daniel leaned forward. 12 years, Emily. 12 years, and you just sign it and stare out the window. Emily turned her head and looked at him then. And for a moment, just a moment, Daniel felt something cold move through his chest. Because her eyes weren't the eyes of a broken woman. They weren't the eyes of someone begging. They were quiet, yes. But there was something underneath the quiet that he had never bothered to look at in all the years he'd known her. "What would you like me to say, Daniel?" she asked. He opened his mouth, then he closed it. Because the truth was, he didn't know. He'd wanted the drama, but now that it wasn't coming, he didn't know what to do with the silence. "I want you to understand," he finally said, "that this is the right thing for both of us. You were never going to be happy in my world. All those dinners, all those investors, all those people. You hated it. You said so yourself." "I never said I hated it," Emily said. "You didn't have to say it. It was written all over your face every single time." Emily almost smiled. Almost. "That wasn't the dinners, Daniel." He didn't ask what she meant. He never asked what she meant. That was in a way the whole story of their marriage, and neither of them said it out loud in that courtroom, but both of them knew it. Daniel had spent 12 years talking, and Emily had spent 12 years listening, and somewhere in there, he had decided that because she was quiet, she was empty. The clerk stamped the papers. The sound was small, a dull thunk of rubber on paper, but it landed in that room like a gavel. It was done. Emily Whitmore was Emily Carter again, and she gathered a single manila folder from the table in front of her, the only thing she'd brought into the courtroom, and she stood up. "You're keeping the folder," Daniel said. "That's what you fought 12 years of marriage to walk out with, a folder." Rachel Monroe laughed. It was a small, private laugh meant only for Daniel, but Emily heard it. Emily heard everything. That was the thing people never understood about her. Quiet people are not deaf. Quiet people are listening. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," Emily said. And that was all. She didn't slam a door. She didn't throw the ring, though she took it off her finger in the hallway and dropped it into the pocket of her plain gray coat without ceremony. She walked toward the front doors of the courthouse with her folder tucked under her arm, a woman in sensible shoes and a coat that had seen 5 winters, and anyone watching would have thought she was a schoolteacher or a librarian or somebody's tired mother. Daniel watched her go, and he felt to his own surprise a flicker of guilt. Not much, but some. He remembered for one unwelcome second the woman she had been when he married her. How she had believed in him when nobody else did. How she had sat up with him the night his first company died, holding his hand while he cried into a bottle of cheap whiskey and swore he'd never try again. How she had said quietly in the dark, "You will build something someday, Daniel. I know it. I know you." He shook the memory off. Sentiment was weakness. That was one of the rules he lived by now. Rachel had taught him that, or maybe he'd always believed it, and Rachel had simply given him permission. "Come on," he said to Rachel. "I've got the Halloran call at 1. "Aren't you going to say goodbye to her?" Rachel asked, amused. "I just did. Legally." He straightened his tie. "She'll be fine. She's a survivor, Emily. Boring, but a survivor. She'll find some little apartment, get a job at a bookstore, and in 10 years, she won't even remember my name." Rachel slid her arm through his. "You're a good man, Daniel." He believed her. That was the thing about Daniel Whitmore. He always believed the people who told him what he wanted to hear. They walked out the front doors of the courthouse into the cold, and that was when everything Daniel Whitmore thought he understood about the world began to come apart. There was a black SUV parked directly in front of the courthouse steps, then another one behind it, then a third. They were not ordinary cars. They were the kind of vehicles that made people slow down and stare polished and enormous and radiating money the way a furnace radiates heat. And standing beside them were men in dark suits with earpieces and the flat, watchful posture of people whose job was to keep other people alive. Daniel slowed down. "What is this?" he muttered. Emily was already at the bottom of the steps, and as she reached the sidewalk, the rear door of the first SUV opened, and a man stepped out. Daniel knew him. Everyone in his industry knew him. That face had been on the cover of every financial magazine in the country. That face belonged to a man who had turned down invitations from 3 different presidents. That face belonged to Alexander Vail. Daniel's mouth went dry. Alexander Vail controlled a private investment empire that touched real estate on 4 continents, an aviation company, a shipping conglomerate, and enough banking interests that a single phone call from him could move markets. Daniel had spent 4 years trying to get a meeting with the man. He had sent proposals. He had sent gifts. He had once flown to Geneva on a rumor that Vail would be at a conference, only to find out the man had never planned to attend. Alexander Vail had never once answered him. Not a letter, not an email, not a single returned call. And now Alexander Vail was standing on a Boston sidewalk in the cold, and he was looking at Emily. "There he is," Rachel whispered. "Daniel, that's Alexander Vail. What is he doing here?" Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't, because Alexander Vail had just done something that made no sense at all. He had opened his arms, and Emily had walked into them. The billionaire folded the quiet woman into an embrace, and Daniel saw him close his eyes, saw his hand come up to cradle the back of her head, the way you hold something precious, something you thought you'd lost. And Daniel heard him say, in a voice thick with emotion, the strangest word Daniel had ever heard, "Home." "Are you ready to come home?" Alexander said. Emily's shoulders, which had been so straight and so controlled all through that courtroom, finally softened. She nodded against his chest. Daniel came down the steps like a man walking in a dream. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Excuse me, Mr. Vail. Alexander, sir. I'm Daniel Whitmore, Whitmore Technologies. I've been trying to reach your office for years. I don't know if your people passed along my—" Alexander Vail looked at him. It was not a warm look. It was the look a man gives a stain on the sidewalk, a thing he has noticed, and is deciding whether to bother stepping around. And in that look, Daniel felt every dollar of the gap between them, felt it like a physical thing, like a hand pressing on his chest. "I know who you are," Alexander said. "You do?" Daniel's heart leapt stupidly hopefully. That's wonderful. I've admired your work for years, and I have to say the fact that you're here, I don't fully understand the connection, but if there's an opportunity—" "Daniel." It was Emily's voice. She had stepped back from her brother, and she was looking at Daniel now with an expression he had never once seen on her face in 12 years. It was not anger. It was something worse. It was pity. "Don't. Emily, do you know this man?" And then Alexander Vail said the words that Daniel Whitmore would replay in his head every night for the rest of his life. She's my sister. The world tilted. I'm sorry, Daniel said. What did you say? Emily is my sister. Alexander's voice was calm and cold and absolutely certain. My younger sister, the daughter of Nathaniel Vale, who built everything you have spent your entire small career trying to touch. She is a Vale, Mr. Whitmore. She was born a Vale. She has always been a Vale. She simply chose not to be one for a little while. His eyes moved over Daniel's expensive suit, his careful haircut, his stunned open mouth. She chose you for reasons that none of us ever understood. And you... He paused, and something flickered in his jaw. A muscle tightening. You signed her away this morning for the price of a one-bedroom apartment. Rachel had gone very still beside Daniel. Her arm had slipped out of his without either of them noticing. That's not possible, Daniel said. He was shaking his head, a small, frantic motion. Emily doesn't have any family. Her parents died when she was young. She grew up in foster homes. She told me. She told me 100 times. She had nothing. She came from nothing. I met her when she was working as a paralegal. She was making $30,000 a year. She was hiding, Alexander said. From what? From people like you. Alexander said it simply, without heat, and that made it worse. From people who would have loved the Vale name and called it love. She wanted God help her. She wanted someone to love Emily, just Emily. The woman, not the fortune. So she changed her name. She walked away from more money than you will earn in 1,000 lifetimes, and she built herself an ordinary life, and she picked an ordinary man, and she gave him 12 years. He looked at Daniel with something like wonder, the wonder you feel looking at an idiot who has thrown away a diamond, thinking it was glass. And this morning, that ordinary man told her she'd be comfortable in a small apartment. Daniel's mind was racing, scrambling, trying to make the pieces fit. Emily. His Emily. The woman who clipped coupons. The woman who drove a 9-year-old Honda. The woman who wore the same gray coat every winter and never once in 12 years asked him for anything expensive. He had thought that was because she was simple. He had thought that was because she didn't know any better. The Honda, he said stupidly. You drive a Honda. Emily looked at him, and for the first time that day, something like sadness passed over her face. I liked the Honda, Daniel. But you could have had anything. You could have had... I had you, she said. For a while I thought that was everything I wanted. The words hung there between them in the cold air. And Daniel, who had spent the entire morning feeling like the most important man in the room, suddenly understood that he had never been the most important person in any room Emily had ever been in. She had let him believe it. She had given him that the way you give a child the biggest slice of cake because it made him happy, and it cost her nothing. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, and his voice broke, and he hated that it broke. 12 years, Emily. We were married for 12 years. Why didn't you ever tell me who you were? Emily was quiet for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was gentle, and that gentleness cut deeper than any scream could have. Because you never asked. That's not fair. I waited, Daniel. She took a step toward him, and her calm cracked just slightly, just enough for him to see the 12 years of hurt underneath it. For 12 years, I waited for you to be curious about me. Just once. I waited for you to ask me a real question. Where did you come from, Emily? What did you dream about when you were a girl, Emily? Why are you so quiet, Emily? What's going on inside that head of yours? Do you know how many times you asked me a question about myself in 12 years and actually waited for the answer? Daniel opened his mouth. Don't guess, Emily said. You'll get it wrong. Rachel spoke up then, and it was the worst possible moment for her to speak, but Rachel had never in her life understood when to be silent. This is ridiculous. If she's some kind of heiress, why would she stay married to you for 12 years scrubbing dishes? It doesn't make sense. She's lying. Or he's lying. Somebody's running a con here. Daniel and I think it's her. Alexander Vale turned his head slowly and looked at Rachel Monroe for the first time. And whatever he saw, it made his expression change into something Daniel had never wanted to be on the receiving end of. Miss Monroe, Alexander said. Rachel blinked. You know my name. I know a great deal about you. Alexander's voice was pleasant, which somehow made it terrifying. I know about the $240,000 in payments that have moved from Whitmore Technologies into accounts connected to you over the past 18 months. I know about the consulting company you formed last spring that has never consulted for anyone. I know quite a lot, actually, about the way you and Mr. Whitmore here have been running his business. He smiled, and it was not a kind smile. You see, my sister is quiet, but she is not blind, and she has been keeping a folder. Mantais. Every head turned to the manila folder tucked under Emily's arm. Daniel felt the ground move under him. "What's in the folder, Emily?" Emily looked down at it. Then she looked back up at him, and her face was calm again, the calm he had mistaken for weakness for 12 long years. "Everything," she said softly. "It's everything, Daniel." And she turned and walked toward the SUV. Emily, wait. Wait!" Daniel started after her, but one of the men in dark suits stepped smoothly into his path, not touching him just there, a wall of shoulders and quiet menace. Daniel stopped. "Emily, please, let's talk about this. Let's just talk. Whatever's in that folder, we can figure it out. We were married, Emily. That has to mean something." Emily paused with her hand on the car door. She didn't turn all the way around. She spoke over her shoulder, and her voice carried in the cold air. "You know what's strange, Daniel? For 12 years, I would have given you anything. If you had ever once come to me and said, 'Emily, the company's in trouble. Emily, I made mistakes. Emily, I need help,' I would have moved heaven and earth for you. I could have called my brother. I could have called men who make Alexander look small. I could have saved you with one phone call." She finally turned and looked at him. "But you didn't want a partner. You wanted an audience, and an audience doesn't get to see the books." "What does that mean?" Daniel's voice was rising now, cracking with panic. "Emily, what does that mean? What's in the folder? What did you find, Emily?" She got into the car. Alexander Vale looked at Daniel Whitmore one last time, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its cold amusement. It was almost quiet. Almost, but not quite sad. "You didn't lose a wife today, Mr. Whitmore." He buttoned his coat against the wind. "You lost the only person who was keeping you alive. You just don't know it yet." Then he got into the car and the doors closed and the 3 black SUVs pulled away from the curb, one after another. And Daniel Whitmore stood on the courthouse sidewalk in the cold Boston morning with Rachel Monroe beside him and watched the woman he had thrown away disappear into a world he had spent his entire life trying and failing to enter. "Daniel," Rachel's voice was small now. All the amusement was gone from it. "What did she mean? What's in the folder?" Daniel didn't answer. He was staring at the empty space where the cars had been. "Daniel," Rachel grabbed his arm. "The payments. He mentioned payments. Daniel, what did she find? Does she have the account records? Daniel, look at me. What is in that folder?" But Daniel Whitmore was not thinking about the folder. Not yet. In that first terrible minute, his mind had latched onto something else, something small and stupid and impossible to shake. 12 years, and he had never asked her a single real question. 12 years, and he hadn't known his own wife's name. He had married a woman named Vale, and he had spent every day of their marriage certain he was the most impressive person in her life. He had felt sorry for her. He had felt at times that he was doing her a favor by staying. He remembered saying to a friend at a bar 2 years ago, "Emily's a good woman, but let's be honest, she'd be nowhere without me. She knows it too. It's why she never complains. She'd be nowhere without me." Daniel started to laugh. It came out of him wrong, a broken, disbelieving sound, and Rachel took a step back from him. "Daniel, you're scaring me." "She'd be nowhere without me," he said, and laughed again, and there were tears in his eyes now, though he couldn't have said if they were from grief or terror or the sheer absurdity of it. "I said that. I actually said that. About Nathaniel Vale's daughter." His phone rang. He almost didn't answer it, but it was a reflex. 20 years of business had trained the reflex into him deeper than thought, and his hand pulled the phone out and his eyes read the name on the screen before his mind could stop him. It was Marcus Reed, the chairman of the board of Whitmore Technologies. Daniel's stomach dropped. Marcus never called. Marcus emailed. Marcus sent his assistant. If Marcus was calling personally on a Tuesday morning, something was wrong. He answered. "Marcus, hi, what's—" Daniel. Marcus Reed's voice was tight, controlled in the way that men are controlled when they are trying not to shout. I need you to come to the office, right now. I've got the Halloran call at 1. I can be there by... Now, Daniel, the Halloran deal is off. The cold that had been living in Daniel's chest since the courthouse steps spread out into his arms, his hands, his fingertips. Off? What do you mean, off? We finalized the terms Friday. Halloran signed the letter of... Halloran pulled out an hour ago. So did the Brennan Group. And I just got off the phone with the bank and they're freezing the credit line pending a review of our books. Marcus took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something very quiet and very dangerous. Daniel, I've been getting calls all morning from people I have never been able to get on the phone in my life. Serious people, people who move real money, and every single one of them is asking me the same question. Daniel's mouth was so dry he could barely form the words. What question? They're asking me, Marcus said, why Whitmore Technologies just made an enemy of the Vale family. The phone nearly slipped out of Daniel's hand. The Vale family, Marcus repeated, as in Vale International, as in Alexander Vale, who, by the way, I have been trying to get an introduction to for 6 years, and who apparently spent this morning at a divorce hearing in Boston. Daniel. Marcus's control finally broke just a little. Is there something you need to tell me? Because right now, I'm hearing that you were married to a Vale for 12 years, that you had no idea, and that you threw her out this morning like she was nothing. Please, please tell me that's not true. Please tell me I'm not about to watch this company I've put 15 years into burn to the ground because you couldn't be bothered to know who you married. Daniel closed his eyes. On the sidewalk beside him, Rachel Monroe was saying his name over and over, but he couldn't hear her anymore. All he could hear was Emily's voice, calm and quiet and patient, the voice he had ignored for 12 years, saying the words she had said in the hallway of the courthouse just before the world ended. Because you never asked. Marcus, Daniel said. His voice didn't sound like his own. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up. He stood on the sidewalk, and for the first time in his adult life, Daniel Whitmore understood that he was afraid. He drove to the office in a fog. He didn't remember the drive afterward, not 1 second of it, only that at some point, Rachel had stopped talking and was staring out the passenger window with her jaw set hard already. He would realize later, already calculating her own exit, already deciding how much of this she could pin on him. The lobby of Whitmore Technologies was too quiet. That was the first thing Daniel noticed. Normally the lobby had a low hum to it, phones and voices, and the espresso machine, the sound of a company that was going somewhere. Today it was silent, and the receptionist, a young woman named Kayla, who had always greeted him with a bright good morning. Mr. Whitmore looked up at him and then looked quickly back down at her desk. She didn't say anything. And Daniel understood with a sick lurch that she already knew. Somehow, in the space of a single morning, everyone already knew. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt like a descent instead of a climb. Marcus Reed was waiting in the glass-walled conference room with 2 other board members, Diane Okafor and Bill Hensley, and the moment Daniel walked in, he could feel the temperature of the room. These were people who had smiled at him at Christmas parties, people who had toasted his vision, people who had told him more than once that he was the future. They were not smiling now. Sit down, Daniel, Marcus said. Daniel sat. Marcus slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a printout of a news alert time-stamped 40 minutes ago from a financial wire service that Daniel had subscribed to for years. He read it, and then he read it again because the words didn't make sense the first time. Vale International confirms family connection distances itself from Whitmore Technologies. They put out a statement, Diane said quietly. An hour ago. It's very short, it's very polite, and it is absolutely devastating. She had it memorized apparently because she recited it without looking down. Vale International wishes to clarify that Emily Vale is a beloved member of the Vale family and has our complete support during this difficult time. Vale International has no financial relationship with Whitmore Technologies, and any prior association is a matter of personal history, not business partnership. Diane looked up. That's it. That's the whole thing. and it just erased $400 million of our market credibility, because Daniel, half the reason anyone took meetings with us was the quiet assumption that we had a veil in the building. I didn't know, Daniel said. His voice was hollow. I swear to God I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, Bill Hensley said. He was the oldest man on the board, 71, silver-haired, a man who had built and sold 3 companies before Daniel was out of college, and he had a way of speaking slowly that made every word land like a stone. You didn't know. You were married to the daughter of Nathaniel Vale for 12 years, and you didn't know. Do you understand how that sounds, son? Do you understand what that tells every investor in this country about your judgment? If you can't see what's sitting across the breakfast table from you, how in God's name are they supposed to trust you to see what's coming for the company? Daniel had no answer. There's more, Marcus said. How can there be more? Marcus looked at the other two, and something passed between them, a decision, and Daniel felt his heart begin to pound, because he knew that whatever came next was the thing that mattered, the thing that Emily had been carrying in a manila folder. We received a package this morning, Marcus said, anonymous, delivered by courier right before the market opened. It contained a summary, just a summary, a few pages, but it's Daniel. It references a complete set of records, detailed records, going back 3 years. Records of what? Marcus didn't blink. The Monroe payments. The consulting company that doesn't consult. The travel that was booked as business and wasn't. The apartment on Beacon Street that the company is paying for that no employee has ever set foot in. He paused. The $240,000, Daniel. The blood drained out of Daniel's face. Now, Marcus continued, and his voice was terribly calm, we don't have the full records, only a summary and a note. The note says that the complete documentation exists, that it is secured, and that it will be provided to the board, to the bank, and to the appropriate authorities if, and only if, there is any attempt to seek revenge against or to financially harm the ordinary employees of this company during whatever comes next. Marcus set down the paper. It's signed with a single initial, the letter E. The room was silent. Daniel stared at the table, and in the silence he finally understood the shape of what Emily had done. She hadn't destroyed him, not yet. She could have. She was holding a bomb in that folder, and she could have simply dropped it and walked away and let it take him and Rachel and the whole company down together. Instead, she had done something far more terrifying. She had made herself the only thing standing between Daniel and total ruin. She had made his survival depend on her mercy. She had, in a single morning, become the most powerful person in his life. And she had done it so quietly that he hadn't even noticed until it was over. Where is she now? Daniel asked. His voice was barely a whisper. We don't know, Diane said. The statement came from Vale International's office in New York. Word is she flew out this morning. Private jet. She hesitated. Daniel, I have to ask you something, and I need you to think very hard before you answer it, because your answer is going to determine what this board does next. Did you ever at any point use your wife's connections to close a deal? Did you ever tell an investor directly or indirectly that the Vale family stood behind this company? Daniel opened his mouth to say no, and then he remembered. He remembered a dinner 4 years ago with a nervous group of angel investors who had been on the fence, and how he had leaned back in his chair and mentioned casually, oh so casually, that his wife came from old money, real old money, the kind of family that didn't put its name on things. He hadn't said Vale. He'd never said Vale because he hadn't known, but he'd painted the picture. He'd let them fill in the blanks. He'd used the mystery of Emily's quietness, the very quietness he mocked her for at home, as a selling point, a whisper of hidden power behind the Whitmore name. He remembered doing it more than once. He remembered doing it honestly, whenever he needed to. And Emily had been sitting right there every single time, quiet, listening, watching him sell a version of her he didn't even understand. Daniel, Marcus said, answer the question. Daniel Whitmore put his head in his hands. I think, he said, and his voice cracked, I think I need a lawyer. Marcus Reed leaned back in his chair. He looked suddenly very old and very tired. Yes, he said, I think you do. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, the office of Whitmore Technologies had gone entirely still. Word had spread the way word always spreads, in whispers and glances, and the sudden silence of people who have heard something they shouldn't have. 200 employees, people with mortgages, and children and car payments sat at their desks and wondered if they would have jobs next week. And not one of them knew that the only reason they still might, the only shield standing between them and the wreckage of Daniel Whitmore's arrogance, was a quiet woman in a 9-year-old Honda who had spent 12 years being told she was nothing. Emily Vale sat in a leather seat 30,000 feet above Connecticut and looked out the window at the clouds. Her brother sat across from her, and he had not stopped watching her since they'd taken off the way you watch someone who has just come back from a long time away, and you're not quite sure yet how much of them made it home. "You could have ended him," Alexander said finally. "This morning, on the sidewalk. You could have handed me that folder, and I would have made sure Daniel Whitmore never worked in this country again. Why didn't you—" Emily didn't look away from the window. "Because it was never about him," she said. "Then what was it about?" She was quiet for a long moment. The engines hummed. The clouds slid past. "For 12 years, Emily said, I let a man decide who I was. I let him tell me I was quiet. I let him tell me I was ordinary. I let him tell me I was lucky to have him. And the worst part, Alex, the part I'm ashamed of, is that some days I believed it." She finally turned from the window and looked at her brother. "I don't want to spend the next 12 years defined by hating him. That's just another way of letting him decide who I am." "So what do you want?" Emily looked down at the manila folder on the seat beside her. She rested her hand on it, and when she looked back up, there was something in her face that Alexander hadn't seen since they were children, since before their father died, since before the money became a weight instead of a gift. There was something alive in it. "I want to find out," she said quietly, "who Emily Vale is when nobody's telling her who to be. I haven't known that answer in a very long time." She smiled small and real. "But I think it's about time I found out." The jet flew on toward New York, carrying a woman who had walked into a courthouse that morning as Daniel Whitmore's quiet, discarded wife and was walking out of the sky as something else entirely. Something Daniel had never once bothered to look for in all the years she had been sitting right in front of him. She was walking out as herself. And back in Boston, in a glass conference room that had gone as silent as a held breath, Daniel Whitmore finally began to understand the true cost of a question he had never bothered to ask. Who was Emily Carter before she became Emily Whitmore? He'd had 12 years to find out. Now he would spend the rest of his life wishing he had. The lawyer arrived at Daniel's office at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and by 4:15, Daniel Whitmore understood that he was in more trouble than he had ever been in his life. His name was Gregory Pratt, and he was the best corporate defense attorney money could buy in Boston, which was exactly why Daniel had called him. Pratt sat across the desk, read the summary from the anonymous package twice, and then set it down very slowly, the way a man sets down something he's afraid might go off. "Daniel," Pratt said, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, because I can't help you if you lie to me. Do you understand?" "Yes." "The $240,000 that moved to Rachel Monroe, was that authorized by the board?" Daniel's throat tightened. "It was structured as consulting fees." "That's not what I asked." Pratt leaned forward. "Was it authorized by the board?" Daniel looked at his hands. "No." Pratt exhaled through his nose. "The Beacon Street apartment. Who lives there?" "Nobody. It's a company asset, for client visits." "Daniel." "Rachel stays there sometimes." "Sometimes." Daniel closed his eyes. "She lives there." Gregory Pratt sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment, and that silence frightened Daniel more than any shouting could have. Because Pratt was a man who charged $900 an hour to talk, and right now he wasn't saying anything at all. "Here's where we are," Pratt finally said. "If everything in this summary is backed by real documentation, and if that documentation is as complete as this note claims, then you are looking at more than a lost company. You're looking at breach of fiduciary duty, possible fraud charges, personal liability. And that's before we even get to the tax questions which, Daniel, believe me, you do not want me to get to." He tapped the paper. "Whoever assembled this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't the work of an angry ex-wife who found a bank statement. This is forensic. This took months, maybe years. She's not Emily's, not she wouldn't." "Emily," Pratt said, "is a Vale. Vale International has an entire in-house legal division that eats men like me for breakfast. If she wanted to, she could have you in a federal courtroom by the end of the month." He paused. "But she doesn't want to. That's the strange part. She could have handed all of this to the authorities this morning and let them take you apart. Instead, she sent a summary to your board and attached a note protecting your employees." Pratt studied him. "Daniel, do you understand what your wife is doing?" "She's not my wife anymore." "Answer the question." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. I don't understand any of it. I don't understand why she stayed. I don't understand why she's protecting anyone. I don't understand why she's not burning me to the ground when she has every reason to." "She's giving you a chance," Pratt said quietly. "I don't know why, but that's what this is. She's holding the match and she's choosing not to strike it. And the only thing you can do right now, the only thing is not give her a reason to change her mind." He gathered the papers. "So here's my advice, and I'm giving it to you for free because it's the most important thing I'll say today. Whatever you do next, do not go after those employees. Do not try to cut costs by gutting the staff. Do not touch a single person on that payroll. Because the moment you do, she drops the folder, and there is nothing on this earth I can do to save you." Daniel nodded numbly, and that should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment Daniel Whitmore listened for once in his life to good advice. But then Rachel Monroe walked into his office without knocking, and everything got worse. She had been crying, or she had made herself look like she'd been crying. Daniel could never quite tell with Rachel anymore. She waited until Pratt had gathered his coat and left, and then she shut the door and turned on Daniel with a fury he'd never seen from her. "They're saying my name in there, Daniel. The board is saying my name. Kayla at the front desk told me security's asking questions about the Beacon Street apartment." Her voice was climbing. "You told me this was handled. You told me the consulting company was clean. You told me nobody would ever look at it." "I didn't know anybody would," Daniel said. "I didn't know she was watching." "You didn't know a lot of things, apparently." Rachel's eyes were hard now, all the tears gone. "You didn't know you married a billionaire. You didn't know she was documenting everything. What else don't you know, Daniel? Because right now I'm standing in the middle of a fire that you started, and I'd like to know how much of it is going to land on me." And there it was. Daniel heard it plain as day, the sound of a woman deciding to save herself. "Rachel," he said carefully, "we're in this together." "Are we?" She folded her arms. "Because from where I'm standing, you're the CEO who authorized the payments, and I'm just the assistant who cashed the check she was told to cash. If this goes to court, I have a very different story than you do." Daniel stared at her. 2 years. 2 years he'd blown up his marriage for this woman. 2 years he'd told himself she understood him in a way Emily never had. And here she was on the worst day of his life, already writing the version of events where she was the victim and he was the villain. "You told me to leave her," Daniel said slowly. "You told me Emily was holding me back. You told me I'd be twice the man without her. That was you, Rachel. Every word of it. And you believed it." Rachel picked up her purse. "That's not my fault, Daniel. That's yours. A smarter man would have asked why a paralegal making 30 grand a year drove herself to work every day in a car she paid off in cash." She opened the door. "You want to know the difference between me and Emily? She was 10 steps ahead of you and never said a word. I was 3 steps ahead of you and you never even noticed. You're not a hard man to get around, Daniel. You just think you are." She walked out. Daniel sat alone in his office as the light faded, and for the first time he understood that he hadn't traded down or traded up. He'd traded one woman who saw everything and protected him for one who saw everything and used it. And he had chosen wrong on every count. That night he did something he hadn't done in years. He drove past the house, his house, the house he and Emily had shared for 9 years before he'd moved into the Beacon Street apartment with Rachel. The lights were off. The Honda was gone from the driveway. She'd taken almost nothing, he realized. Her clothes, some books, the folder. She'd left the furniture, the wedding china, the framed photographs. She'd walked out of 12 years with a suitcase and a manila envelope, and it had been enough to bring his entire world down. He sat in the car outside the dark house and he called her. It rang 4 times. He was sure it would go to voicemail, and then impossibly she answered. "Daniel." Just his name. Calm, even, the way she'd always said it. "Emily." His voice cracked immediately, and he hated it. "Emily, please. Please just talk to me." There was a pause. He could hear something behind her, the quiet murmur of a large house, a clock somewhere. She was in Connecticut, he realized. The Vale Estate. She was standing in a home worth more than everything he'd ever built, and she'd answered the phone for him anyway. "I'm listening," she said. "I didn't know," he said. The words came out in a rush. "Emily, I swear to God I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" "Stop." Her voice didn't rise, but it stopped him cold. "Think very carefully about how you were about to finish that sentence, Daniel. If you had known I was a Vale, what you would have treated me better, you would have loved me more, you would have asked me a single question about my life." A long pause. "Do you hear yourself? You just told me that the only thing that could have made me worth respecting was money, the one thing I spent my whole life running away from." Daniel opened his mouth and found he had nothing to say because she was right, and they both knew it. "That's what I could never make you understand," Emily went on, and now for the first time he heard something underneath the calm. Grief. Old, worn-down grief. "I didn't marry you to be adored, Daniel. I married you because the night your first company died, you cried in my arms, and you were just a person, just a scared human person. And for one night you needed me, and you let me see it. I thought, this is a man I can build a life with. This is a man who will let me in." Her voice tightened. "But you never cried in front of me again. You got successful, and you decided you didn't need anyone. And every year you closed a little more, until the woman who held you that night was just, what did you tell your friends, dead weight. A corpse you were dragging around." Daniel's eyes stung. "You heard about that. I hear everything, Daniel. I always have. You just never noticed I was in the room." "I'm sorry." It came out broken. "Emily, I am so sorry for all of it. For Rachel, for the things I said, for God, for 12 years of being." "I know," she said. And the terrible thing was, she said it gently. "I know you're sorry. I believe you. But do you understand that your being sorry doesn't change anything about who you are? You're not sorry because you understand what you did. You're sorry because it cost you. If the jet hadn't shown up this morning, if I'd walked out of that courthouse in my gray coat and gotten into my Honda and disappeared exactly like you expected, you would never have thought about me again. You said so yourself. In 10 years, I wouldn't even remember your name." Daniel went cold. "How did you—" "Rachel isn't the only one who's 3 steps ahead of you," Emily said. "I told you, I hear everything." The line was quiet for a moment. "What's going to happen to me?" Daniel finally asked. It was a child's question, small and frightened, and he was ashamed of it, even as it left his mouth. "That depends on you," Emily said. "The folder stays closed as long as you don't hurt anyone else. The people who work for you, the people who trusted you, they get to keep their jobs and their lives. You do that one thing, you protect them, and I stay out of it. But the moment you decide to save yourself by throwing 200 families under the bus, Daniel, that's the moment I stop being merciful." A pause. "Do you understand me?" "I understand." "Good." And then softer, almost to herself. "I hope you do. I really do. I'd like to believe there's still something in you worth the mercy." She hung up. Daniel sat in the dark car outside the dark house and put his forehead against the steering wheel, and for the first time since he was a boy, Daniel Whitmore wept. Not for the company, not even if he was honest for Emily. He wept because he had finally seen himself clearly, and he did not like what he saw. The next morning, 10 o'clock, the board reconvened. And this was where Daniel Whitmore had his second chance to listen and his second chance to fail. Because sitting in the conference room, along with Marcus Reed and the others, was a man Daniel didn't recognize. A young man, sharp-eyed in a suit that fit too well. Marcus introduced him as Thomas Vale, Alexander's son, Emily's nephew. "Mr. Whitmore," Thomas said, and he didn't offer his hand. "My aunt asked me to observe these proceedings, not to interfere, just to watch." He smiled thinly. "She wants to make sure everyone plays fair." The message could not have been clearer. Emily might be in Connecticut, but she was watching. She would always be watching. Marcus took control of the meeting. "Daniel, the board has reached a decision, and I'll be direct because you deserve directness. We're removing you as CEO effective immediately." Daniel had known it was coming. He'd known since Marcus's phone call the previous morning, and still hearing the words out loud, it hit him like a physical blow. Marcus, let me finish. Marcus's voice was not unkind, and somehow that made it worse. We're removing you as CEO, but we are not removing you from the company entirely, and we are not at this time pursuing charges. That was a very hard decision. Daniel and I want you to understand something. We didn't make it for you. We made it because of a phone call I received this morning. Daniel's head came up. From who? From Emily. Marcus said it plainly. She called me personally. She asked, and I'm quoting her, now she asked us not to prosecute you, if we could avoid it, because a prosecution would freeze the company's assets, and that would put the employees at risk, she said. And I'll never forget this, as long as I live, she said. Punish him, however the law and the board require, but do not let your anger at one man cost 200 innocent people their livelihoods. Marcus looked at Daniel. Your ex-wife, the woman you threw a ring at yesterday morning, spent last night on the phone protecting the very company you built while ignoring her. Do you understand what kind of person you were married to, Daniel? Do you finally understand what you had? Daniel couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. Thomas Vale spoke up from the corner. My aunt has one condition, and it's not negotiable. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. She's requesting that the company create a fund, severance protection for every employee funded from executive compensation. Yours specifically. The bonuses you paid yourself over the last 3 years, the ones the board didn't fully approve, get clawed back and put into a fund that guarantees any employee laid off during the restructuring gets a full year of pay and health coverage. He paused. She's not asking the company to pay for your mistakes, Mr. Whitmore. She's asking you to. Daniel stared at the paper. He realized a demand for nearly everything he had. His bonuses, his savings, the money he'd been so proud of, the money that made him feel like a man who'd built something. She was asking him to give it all to the people he'd been ready to sacrifice, and she was giving him the choice. That was the thing he understood sitting in that conference room. She wasn't taking it from him. She could have. She could have had a court freeze every account he owned. Instead, she was asking him to give it freely, to make it a choice, because a choice was the one thing Daniel Whitmore had never given her in 12 years of marriage. He picked up the pen. For a long moment, the old Daniel screamed at him. That's your money. You earned it. You built this company with your own hands. Don't let her take it. Fight. Get a better lawyer. Bury the folder. Find a way. And then he thought of Emily's voice on the phone the night before, worn down and grieving. I'd like to believe there's still something in you worth the mercy. He signed. Marcus Reed watched him do it, and something in the old man's face softened just slightly. That was the right thing, Daniel, he said quietly. Maybe the first right thing you've done in a while. Tell her. Daniel started and his voice failed. He tried again. Tell her I signed. Tell her I'm trying. Thomas Vale gathered the paper. I'll tell her, he said. And then at the door, he paused and looked back, and for the first time, there was something almost human in his young face. For what it's worth, Mr. Whitmore, she talks about you like you were a good man once, before the money. She said you used to be someone worth loving. He shrugged. I don't know if that helps, but she said it, and my aunt doesn't say things she doesn't mean. Then he was gone. But Rachel Monroe was not finished. That was the part Daniel didn't see coming, the part that turned a bad week into a catastrophe. Because while Daniel was in that conference room signing away his fortune to protect his employees, Rachel Monroe was in a lawyer's office of her own, and she was making a very different choice. Daniel found out at 7 that evening when a courier delivered an envelope to his apartment. Inside was a legal notice. Rachel Monroe was filing a wrongful termination and harassment claim against Whitmore Technologies. And attached to it as supporting evidence were copies of emails, Daniel's emails he had sent to Rachel over 2 years, some of them intimate, some of them careless, and several of them, Daniel realized with mounting horror, discussing the very payments and arrangements that the board was trying to keep quiet. Rachel wasn't just saving herself. She was setting fire to the whole thing on her way out, and she didn't care who burned, because if she was going down, she was taking Daniel with her, and she was doing it in a way that would drag every detail into public court records, where the folder's careful mercy couldn't protect anyone. Daniel's hands were shaking as he read it, because he understood immediately what it meant. Rachel's lawsuit would force discovery. It would force the emails into the open. It would force the board to explain the payments in a public filing. And once it was public, once it was in the court record, Emily's quiet mercy became worthless because you cannot unring a bell. The employees, the company, everything Emily had been trying to protect, all of it, was about to be dragged into daylight by a woman who had nothing left to lose. He called Emily before he could think better of it. She answered on the second ring this time. "Daniel?" Rachel's suing. The words tumbled out. Wrongful termination. She's got emails, Emily. She's got everything. She's going to make it all public. The payments, the apartment, all of it. And once it's in the court record, I can't, the board can't, none of us can protect the— "Daniel!" Her voice cut through his panic like a blade through water. "Breathe! Where are you?" "My apartment. The Beacon Street apartment. A courier just brought the— "Read me the name of her attorney." He fumbled with the paper. "It's a firm called Costa and Rowe. The attorney is a woman named Patricia Rowe." There was a silence on the line, and then very quietly Emily laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was something almost tired, almost sad. "Of course it is," Emily said. "You know her." "I know the firm." A pause. "Daniel, I need you to listen to me very carefully now, and I need you to do exactly what I say, and I need you not to ask questions. Can you do that? For once in your life, can you just listen?" Yes. He'd never meant a word so completely. Yes, anything. Do not respond to the lawsuit. Do not call Rachel. Do not call your lawyer to make a counteroffer. Do nothing. Do you understand me? Whatever your instinct is telling you to do right now, do the opposite of it, which is nothing. "But the emails, the discovery, if this goes public—" "It's not going to go public," Emily said, "because Patricia Rowe is going to get a phone call in about an hour that is going to change her entire understanding of the situation she's walked into." A pause. "Rachel thinks she's holding a weapon, Daniel. She thinks those emails give her power. She has no idea that the moment she filed that lawsuit, she stepped into a room that I have controlled her whole life without her ever knowing it existed." Daniel's mouth was dry. "Emily, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to do what I should have let Alexander do from the beginning," Emily said, and for the first time since the courthouse, there was iron in her voice, cold and absolute. "I'm going to remind everyone involved exactly whose family they're dealing with. Rachel wanted a war. She picked the one person in the world she should never have picked it with." A pause. "I protected you, Daniel. I protected the employees. I even protected Rachel up until an hour ago, because taking away someone's livelihood is a serious thing, and I don't do it lightly. But she just chose to burn 200 innocent people to save herself, and that I will not allow." Daniel sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing any of this after everything? After what I did to you? Why are you still fighting to protect all of us?" There was a long silence on the line. "Because I know what it's like," Emily finally said, "to be a person that everyone decided was worthless. To sit in a room and have people talk about you like you're not there. To be the quiet one, the small one, the one who doesn't matter." Her voice was very soft now. "Those 200 people who work for you, Daniel, they're not powerful. They don't have a folder. They don't have a brother with a jet. They're just people trying to hold their lives together, and they made the mistake of trusting the wrong man. I'm not going to let them drown because you and Rachel decided to fight over the wreckage of a marriage that was already dead." A pause. "I'm not doing it for you. I want you to be very clear about that. I stopped doing things for you a long time ago. I'm doing it because it's right, and because I finally learned the difference between being quiet and being powerless. I was never powerless, Daniel. I was just waiting to find out what I was willing to fight for." Daniel closed his eyes. "And what are you willing to fight for?" "Not you," she said without cruelty, simply as fact. "Never you again. But them, the innocent ones, for them I'll burn the whole thing down and rebuild it with my own hands." A beat. "Now do what I told you. Do nothing. And Daniel, yes, whatever you hear about what happens to Rachel over the next few days," Emily said, "remember that she chose it, every bit of it. She had a chance to walk away quietly and keep her freedom. She chose to pick up a weapon and swing it at children. What happens next is not my cruelty, it's her consequence." The line went dead. Daniel sat in the apartment he'd shared with Rachel, surrounded by furniture she'd picked out. And he understood that he was watching two women who had both been in his life for years, and he had spent all his energy on the wrong one. He'd thrown away the one who was building a fund to protect his employees, and he'd built his future around the one who was suing to destroy them. He had, it turned out, understood nothing about anyone, least of all himself. An hour later, exactly as Emily had promised, Patricia Rowe's phone rang. Daniel didn't know the details of that call, not then. He would learn them later in pieces. But he would learn that the call came from the General Counsel of Vail International. He would learn that Patricia Rowe's firm did a significant amount of work for a real estate group that turned out through 3 layers of holding companies to be owned by the Vail family. He would learn that within 20 minutes of that phone call, Patricia Rowe informed Rachel Monroe that her firm was withdrawing from representation due to an unforeseen conflict of interest. He would learn that every other firm in Boston that might have taken Rachel's case suddenly mysteriously found themselves too busy, too conflicted, too unavailable. He would learn that this was what real power looked like. Not shouting, not fists on tables, not rings thrown across courtrooms, just a phone call made quietly by a woman who had spent 12 years letting everyone believe she was nobody. But that night, Daniel knew none of it yet. That night he only knew that he had done the one thing Emily asked. He had done nothing. He had sat still and trusted her, this woman he had spent 12 years failing to see, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, trusting her felt like the only solid ground beneath his feet. And 100 miles away, in a study in a great house in Connecticut, Emily Vail set down her phone and looked out at the dark, and Alexander appeared in the doorway behind her. "You handled Rachel," he said. It wasn't a question. "I handled Rachel. You could have handled Daniel the same way, weeks ago, one phone call." Alexander crossed the room and stood beside her. "You still could. Tonight. You could end him completely and no one would ever question it. Not after what he did to you." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said, "but you won't." "No." Alexander studied his sister's profile in the dim light. "Why not? And don't tell me it's about the employees. You've made your point about the employees. This is about Daniel specifically. You keep leaving him a door. Why?" Emily didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was very quiet. "Because 12 years ago, a scared young man cried in my arms and let me see who he really was underneath all the ambition. And I loved that man, Alex. I really did." She turned from the window. "That man is dead. Daniel killed him a long time ago, choice by choice, and I've made my peace with that. But I keep leaving the door open just a crack because some small, foolish part of me still wonders if the man I loved is in there somewhere buried under everything he became. And I want to give him the chance to walk back through it, not for him, for me. So that when this is all over, I'll know I gave him every chance, and if he still chose to be the man he is, that's on him, not on me. I'll be free of it." Alexander was silent for a long moment. "You're a better person than I am," he finally said. Emily smiled faintly. "No, I'm just a person who spent 12 years learning what it costs to be underestimated. I don't want to become someone who does it to others, even to him, especially to him." Outside, the wind moved through the old trees of the Vail estate, and inside, the woman that Daniel Whitmore had thrown away stood quietly in the dark, holding more power in her patience than her ex-husband had accumulated in a lifetime of grasping and choosing again and again not to use it to destroy, only to protect, only to give one broken, arrogant man one last chance to become someone worth the mercy she kept against all reason extending to him. And somewhere in Boston, in an apartment that no longer felt like his, Daniel Whitmore sat in the dark and did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He trusted her, and he waited to find out whether he had at long last learned anything at all. Rachel Monroe did not go quietly. That was her first mistake, and by the time she understood it was a mistake, it was already too late. 2 days after Patricia Rowe dropped her as a client, Rachel had called 11 law firms in Boston, and 11 law firms had turned her away. Some were polite, some were vague. One senior partner simply said, "I'm sorry, Ms. Monroe, we're not able to take this on," and hung up before she could ask why. By the 12th call, Rachel understood that something was happening to her that she couldn't see and couldn't fight, and that terrified her more than any lawsuit ever could. So she did the only thing she had left. She showed up at Daniel's apartment. He almost didn't open the door. Through the peephole, she looked smaller than he remembered, her makeup gone, her hair pulled back, wearing a sweatshirt he'd never seen. She looked for the first time since he'd known her like an ordinary, frightened person. He opened the door. "They blackballed me," Rachel said. She didn't wait to be invited in. She pushed past him into the apartment, her voice shaking. "Every firm in the city. 11 of them, Daniel. Nobody will touch my case. You want to tell me how that happens? You want to tell me how a legitimate wrongful termination claim suddenly can't find a single lawyer in Boston?" "Rachel." "It's her, isn't it?" Rachel spun to face him. "It's Emily. She did this. She reached out and she erased me. Like I'm nothing." Daniel looked at the woman he'd blown up his life for, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not even satisfaction. Just a deep, tired sadness. "You brought this on yourself," he said quietly. "Excuse me." "You had a way out, Rachel. You could have walked away, kept your head down, found a job in another city. Nobody was coming after you. Emily wasn't going to touch you as long as you didn't hurt anyone." He shook his head. "But you filed that lawsuit. You put those emails in a legal record where they'd become public. You were willing to let 200 people lose their jobs so you could squeeze a settlement out of a company that was already bleeding. And you did it to protect yourself." He met her eyes. "You want to know how it happens, Rachel? How a woman like Emily erases you. She doesn't. You erase yourself. She just stops protecting you from the consequences." Rachel stared at him, and then slowly her fear curdled into something uglier. "You're in love with her," she said. "My God, after everything. She's ruining me. She took your company, she took your money, and you're standing here defending her." She laughed, a brittle sound. "You know what, Daniel? You two deserve each other. The pathetic little man and his invisible wife. I hope you're very happy." "I'm not in love with her," Daniel said, and he was surprised to find it was true. "I lost the right to love her a long time ago. This isn't love, Rachel. This is me finally understanding 12 years too late exactly what kind of person I threw away, and exactly what kind of person I picked up instead." He opened the door. "You should go, and Rachel, don't file anything else. Don't fight this. Whatever settlement they offer you, take it, sign the paperwork, and disappear. Because right now, the only thing standing between you and something much worse than blackballing is the mercy of a woman you spent 2 years mocking. And I don't know how long that mercy lasts." Rachel left, and 3 days later, exactly as Daniel had predicted, a settlement offer arrived at the address Rachel had given the courts. It was generous, more generous than Rachel deserved, enough to relocate and start over somewhere far away. Attached to it was a non-disclosure agreement and a single condition that Rachel Monroe would never again contact Daniel Whitmore, the company, or anyone connected to the Vale family. Rachel signed it. She took the money, and she disappeared from the story entirely, a woman who had gambled everything on the belief that the quiet wife was weak and lost. Daniel never saw her again, but the settling of Rachel was only the surface of what was happening that week. Underneath it, in offices in New York and Connecticut, something much larger was moving, and Daniel had no idea until Marcus Reed called him into the conference room on a Thursday morning and told him to sit down. "The company's being acquired," Marcus said. Daniel's stomach dropped. "By who?" Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "That's the thing, Daniel. We had 2 offers on the table, 2 serious buyers, both moving fast, both trying to grab Whitmore Technologies while it's wounded and cheap." He folded his hands. "The first offer is from a private equity group called Sterling Crest. You've heard of them. They buy distressed companies, strip them for parts, lay off the staff, sell the assets, and walk away with the profit. If they win, this company ceases to exist within 6 months, and every single person on this floor is unemployed by Christmas." Daniel felt sick. "And the second offer?" "The second offer," Marcus said slowly, "is from Vale International." The room went very quiet. "Emily," Daniel said. "Emily." Marcus nodded. "Her offer is lower, Daniel. meaningfully lower. Sterling Crest is offering the board and the shareholders more money. If the board votes purely on the numbers, Sterling Crest wins and the company dies. He paused. But Emily's offer comes with conditions. She's guaranteeing every job, every single one. She's committing to keep the company intact, invest in it, rebuild it. She's offering the shareholders less money and the employees their entire future. Marcus leaned back. And she's put the decision in the board's hands. She won't use her leverage. She won't call in favors. She could force this, Daniel. With everything she has on you on the company, she could make Sterling Crest disappear with a phone call, the same way she made Rachel's lawyers disappear. But she won't. She said, and I'm quoting again, she said she wants the board to choose with clear eyes, money or people. She won't make the choice for us. Daniel understood then what she was doing. She was doing to the board exactly what she'd done to him. She was refusing to take the choice away from them. She was making them decide freely what kind of company they wanted to be. "When's the vote?" Daniel asked. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Marcus stood. "And Daniel, there's one more thing. You still hold shares. Not many after the clawback, but enough to matter in a close vote, which this is going to be." He looked at his former CEO. "You get to vote, Daniel. You get to help decide. The man who caused all of this gets a say in how it ends." He walked to the door, then paused. "Emily insisted on that too, by the way, that you keep your voting rights. I asked her why. You want to know what she said?" Daniel could barely speak. "What did she say?" "She said, because I want to know what he does when it's real, when it costs him something, when there's no one watching and no reward. I want to know if there's anything left in there worth saving." Marcus opened the door. "So that's the question, Daniel. That's the whole question laid out plain. Tomorrow morning you find out the answer to it. And so does she." That night, Daniel Whitmore did not sleep. He sat in the dark apartment and he thought about the vote. Sterling Crest's offer would put money in his pocket. Even after the clawback. Even after everything, a sale at Sterling Crest's price would leave him with enough to land on his feet to start over, to buy back some piece of the life he'd lost. Emily's offer would leave him with almost nothing. A minority stake in a company he no longer ran, controlled by the family of the woman he'd betrayed. The old Daniel knew exactly how to vote. The old Daniel would have voted for the money without a second thought and told himself the employees weren't his problem anymore. But the old Daniel had thrown a ring across a courtroom, and the old Daniel had lost everything that mattered, and Daniel was beginning to understand that the old Daniel had been a fool his entire life. At 3 a.m, he called her. He didn't expect her to answer. It was insane to call at 3 a.m, but the phone rang once, twice, and then her voice awake, alert, as if she'd been waiting. "Daniel." "Why are you awake? Why are you calling?" A pause. "You first." He closed his eyes. "I don't know how to vote." Silence on the line, and then gently, "Yes, you do. Emily, you know exactly how to vote, Daniel. You've known since Marcus told you. The only question is whether you have the courage to do it." Her voice was quiet, patient, the voice she'd used with him 1,000 times in 12 years. The voice he'd never once understood was a gift. The Daniel I married would have known instantly. He'd have voted for the people without even having to think about it, because that Daniel, the one who cried in my arms all those years ago, he understood something the successful Daniel forgot. He understood that a man is measured by what he does for people who can't do anything for him in return. "That Daniel's dead," he said. "You said so yourself." "I did." A pause. "But you called me at 3 a.m. because you can't sleep, because a choice about 200 strangers is tearing you apart. The old Daniel wouldn't have lost a minute of sleep." Her voice softened even further. "Dead men don't lie awake wrestling with their conscience, Daniel. Maybe he's not as dead as I thought. Maybe he's just been buried a long time." Daniel's throat closed. "Emily, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "All right. If I vote for your offer, if I do the right thing, is there any chance, any at all, that you and I—" "No," she said. She said it before he'd even finished the sentence, and she said it gently, but she said it without a flicker of doubt. "No, Daniel, there's no chance. There was never going to be a chance. I want you to understand that before you vote tomorrow, because I don't want you doing the right thing for the wrong reason. I don't want you voting for those people because you think it'll win me back. It won't. Nothing will. That door is closed, and it's never opening again." A pause. "If you vote for those employees tomorrow, you have to do it for them. For the security guard who's putting a kid through college, for the woman in accounting who's caring for her sick mother, for the 200 people whose entire lives are sitting in your hands. Not for me. Never again for me." Her voice was steady and clear. "Can you do that, Daniel? Can you do something good in this world without a reward attached to it? Because if you can't, then you really are the man I divorced, and no vote is going to change that." The line went quiet. Daniel sat in the dark for a long time. "I understand," he finally said. "I hope you do." A pause, and then softer, almost kind. "Get some sleep, Daniel. Tomorrow's a big day. You're going to find out who you are. That's a rare thing, you know. Most people go their whole lives never finding out. You get to find out at 9 o'clock in the morning." She hung up, and Daniel Whitmore lay down in the dark, and somewhere near dawn, he finally slept. The vote was at 9. The conference room was full. The full board, the corporate secretary lawyers for both offers, and in the corner saying nothing, watching everything Thomas Vale. Emily was not there. Daniel had known she wouldn't be. She was in Connecticut waiting, choosing not to put her thumb on the scale, choosing to let the room decide who it wanted to be. Marcus Reed called the meeting to order. He laid out both offers one final time in plain terms. The Sterling Crest offer and its higher price and its certain destruction. The Vale offer and its lower price and its guarantee of every job. And then he called the vote. They went around the table. Diane Okafor voted for Vale. Bill Hensley voted for Vale. And when he did, his old voice cracked and he said, "I've laid off enough people in my life. I'm too old to do it again to people who don't deserve it." 2 other members voted for Sterling Crest, cold and clear-eyed, choosing the money. Then 2 more for Vale. The votes stacked up closer and closer, and it came down exactly as Marcus had warned, to the shares, to the margins, to the last few votes, to Daniel. Marcus looked at him across the table. "Daniel Whitmore, how do you vote?" The room turned to him. Every face. The lawyers, the board, Thomas Vale in the corner with his aunt's eyes. And Daniel understood that this was the moment. Not the courthouse, not the phone calls. This was the moment that would decide who he was once and for all, because there was no audience here who would love him for it. No wife to win back, no reward, no camera, nothing. Just 200 strangers whose lives were in his hands, and a choice that would cost him everything he had left. He thought about the security guard putting a kid through college. He thought about the woman in accounting caring for her mother. He thought about Kayla at the front desk, who used to say "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," before she learned who he really was. He thought about a young man crying in the arms of a woman who believed in him a lifetime ago, before the money, before the arrogance, before he became someone worth divorcing. "I vote for Vale," Daniel said. The words came out steady, and when they left his mouth, something loosened in his chest that had been clenched tight for 12 years. Some old, cold, grasping thing finally letting go. "I vote for the people," Daniel said. "I vote for every job. I vote to give up my shares, my payout, all of it. I vote for the offer that leaves me with nothing and saves everyone else." The room was silent. "Istal." Marcus Reed looked at him for a long moment, and then the old man nodded slowly, and something in his weathered face that had been hard toward Daniel for weeks finally quietly softened. "The motion carries," Marcus said. "Whitmore Technologies will be acquired by Vale International. All positions guaranteed. All employees protected." He set down his pen. Meeting adjourned. And that was it. In the space of a single sentence, it was over. The company Daniel had built with such hunger, such ambition, such certainty, that it made him important, passed into the hands of the woman he had thrown away. And Daniel Whitmore, who had walked into a courthouse 3 weeks earlier, certain he was the most important man in every room, walked out of that conference room with nothing at all, except perhaps for the first time in his adult life, the quiet knowledge that he had done something right. Thomas Vale caught him at the elevator. "Mr. Whitmore," the young man's expression was unreadable. "My aunt wanted me to give you a message, if the vote went the way it went." Daniel's heart clenched. What message? Thomas held out a folded piece of paper. She wrote it herself, last night, before she knew how you'd vote. He pressed it into Daniel's hand. She said to give it to you either way, but she said the meaning changes depending on what you chose. He stepped into the elevator. I guess you get to find out which meaning is yours. The doors closed. Daniel stood alone in the hallway holding the paper. He unfolded it with shaking hands. It was Emily's handwriting, small and neat and unhurried, the handwriting he'd watched sign 1,000 grocery lists and birthday cards, and finally a divorce decree. It said, I always knew who you could be. I just couldn't make you see it. If you're reading this and you voted for the money, then I was wrong, and I can finally let you go without wondering. But if you voted for them, for the people who couldn't give you anything back then, know this. The man I married wasn't dead after all. He just needed to lose everything to find himself. I'm not coming back to you, Daniel, but I'm glad, so glad that you finally became someone I could have been proud of. Be him from now on. Not for me, for you. Emily. Daniel Whitmore stood alone in the hallway of the company he no longer owned, holding a note from the woman he'd thrown away, and he wept for the second time in 3 weeks. But these were different tears. Not tears of fear or self-pity or loss. They were the tears of a man who has looked at the wreckage of his own life and finally understood how he had built it plank by plank, choice by choice. And who understood, too, that it was not too late to build something else. 100 miles north in the study of the great house in Connecticut, Emily Vale's phone buzzed with a single text from her nephew. 3 words. He chose them. Emily read it. She set the phone down, and she walked to the window and looked out at the grounds, at the old trees her father had planted, at the life she'd walked away from and walked back to as an entirely different woman than the one who'd left. Alexander found her there. The board voted, he said. Vale International owns Whitmore Technologies. The employees are safe. He watched her. And Daniel voted for them, gave up everything. You were right about him. There was something left. I know, Emily said quietly. You could take him back now, you know. If you wanted to. He's proven himself. He's a different man. Emily smiled, small and sad and free. No, she said. You still don't understand, do you? None of this was ever about getting him back. It was about becoming someone who didn't need him, someone who didn't need anyone's permission to be powerful, someone who could look at a man who'd destroyed her and choose mercy, not because she was weak, but because she was finally completely strong. She turned from the window. I didn't save Daniel, Alex. Daniel saved himself at the very last minute when it counted. All I did was leave the door open. What he walked through on his own 2 feet. And now... Emily looked out at the trees her father had planted, and for the first time in 12 years, maybe for the first time in her whole life, she felt the weight of other people's expectations lift entirely off her shoulders. No husband to please, no family name to hide from, no quiet wife to perform. Just Emily. Just herself. Whoever that turned out to be. Now, she said, I find out what I want. For the first time in my life, I get to build something that's only mine. She smiled. And I have absolutely no idea what it is yet. Isn't that wonderful? Outside, the wind moved through the old trees, and inside, a woman who had spent 12 years being told she was nothing stood in the light of her own life, free at last, and utterly quietly unafraid of what came next. The problem with being free, Emily Vale discovered, was that freedom asks you a question you've spent your whole life avoiding. Who are you when nobody is telling you who to be? For the first 2 weeks after the vote, she had no answer. She woke in the great house in Connecticut, in the bedroom that had been hers as a girl, and she lay in the enormous quiet and felt something she hadn't expected. Not peace, restlessness. She had spent 12 years being needed by Daniel, being defined by the shape of another person's life. And now that the shape was gone, she felt strangely weightless, the way a swimmer feels when her feet can no longer touch the bottom. Alexander noticed. Alexander noticed everything. You're not sleeping, he said one morning at breakfast. I'm sleeping fine. Emily. He set down his coffee. I've known you your entire life. You're doing the thing you did when we were children, and something was eating at you. You go very still and very polite, and you smile at everyone, and inside you're 1,000 miles away. He studied her. You won. You saved the employees. You handled Rachel. You gave Daniel his chance, and he took it. It's over. So why do you look like a woman standing at the edge of something? Emily was quiet for a long moment. Because I don't know what comes next, she admitted. For 12 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was Daniel's wife. I organized his life. I managed his crises. I was quiet, and I was patient, and I was always waiting for the moment I could finally actually be myself. She turned her cup slowly in her hands. And now the moment's here. There's nothing in my way. No husband, no secret to keep, no name to hide behind. And I realized this morning that I have absolutely no idea what I actually want. I spent so long being what everyone else needed that I forgot to ever ask myself the question. She looked up. Isn't that pathetic, Alex? I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and I'm sitting here at 41 years old with no idea who I am. Alexander didn't laugh. He looked at his sister with something close to tenderness. It's not pathetic, he said. It's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. He leaned back. You know what I think. I think you should stop trying to figure out who you are and start paying attention to what makes you angry. That's where it always is for people like us. The thing that makes you angry is the thing you're supposed to fix. Emily thought about that for a long time, and she realized she already knew the answer. She'd known it the moment she stood in that courthouse. She'd known it every time she thought about the 200 employees whose lives had hung in the balance because of one arrogant man. She'd known it really her whole life. What made her angry was watching powerful people decide that quiet people didn't matter. That was the thing. That was the wound at the center of everything. She had spent 12 years being told she was nothing, and she'd survived it because she had a secret escape hatch, a family, a fortune, a brother with a jet. But the women she'd sat next to in courthouses over the years, the ones getting divorced from men who'd controlled every dollar, the ones walking out with nothing and nowhere to go, they had no escape hatch. They had no folder. They had no Alexander. They were exactly who Daniel had believed Emily to be, and they were drowning, and nobody with power ever looked twice. 3 weeks after the vote, Emily walked into Alexander's office and told him what she wanted to build. A foundation, she said. For women who lose everything in a divorce, not charity, not a handout, real support, legal help so they don't get steamrolled by husbands with better lawyers, financial education so they never have to depend on a man's mercy for a roof over their heads again, job training, emergency housing. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke surer, and Alexander watched something come alive in his sister that he hadn't seen in years. I want to build the thing I would have needed if I'd really been the woman Daniel thought I was. I want to be the jet that shows up for women who don't have a brother. Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. There she is, he said softly. There's my sister. The Carter Foundation, she named it. Not Vale. Carter. The name she'd chosen for herself when she walked away from the fortune. The name Daniel had known her by the name of the ordinary woman she'd built out of nothing. Because that she decided was who this was for. Not for the Vales. For the Carters. For every quiet woman who'd been told she was ordinary by a man too arrogant to look closely. She threw herself into it with a focus that startled even her. She hired staff. She partnered with legal aid organizations. She funded emergency housing in 3 cities in the first 2 months. And she did something that no one expected, least of all Alexander. She didn't run it from behind a desk. She showed up. She sat in courthouses, the same courthouses she'd once walked out of herself, and she watched women sign away their lives with shaking hands, and afterward, quietly, she made sure someone was there for them. A lawyer, a caseworker, a folder of resources, a hand on the shoulder that said, "You are not nothing, and you are not alone." One afternoon, 6 months after the divorce, Emily was sitting in the back of a family court in Hartford when she saw a woman she recognized. Not personally. She recognized the type. The woman was in her 50s, wearing a coat that had seen too many winters, and she was sitting alone on the far side of the courtroom while her husband sat surrounded by 2 lawyers and a woman half his age. The wife had no lawyer. She had a folder of papers she clearly didn't understand, and a face that had given up hoping anyone would help. Emily watched the whole thing. She watched the husband's lawyers run circles around the woman. She watched the judge, overworked and exhausted, try to slow things down but ultimately move the docket along. She watched a 53-year-old woman named Margaret Sullivan get stripped of 30 years of her life in 45 minutes because she couldn't afford to fight back. And when it was over, when Margaret Sullivan walked out of that courtroom into a life with nothing, Emily was waiting for her in the hallway. "Mrs. Sullivan," Emily said gently, "my name is Emily. I run a foundation that helps women in exactly your situation. Legal help, housing, job placement, all of it free." She held out a card. "You don't have to face this alone." Margaret Sullivan looked at the card. Then she looked at Emily, and her eyes filled with tears, and she said the thing that Emily would carry with her for the rest of her life, the thing that told her finally that she'd found the answer to the question Freedom had been asking. "Nobody's ever offered to help me before," Margaret whispered. "In 30 years, nobody ever once looked at me and thought I was worth helping." Emily took her hand. "I did," she said, "and I always will." That was the moment Emily Vale stopped grieving the 12 years she'd lost, because she understood, standing in that hallway holding a stranger's hand, that the 12 years hadn't been wasted after all. They'd been training. Every quiet dinner she'd endured, every time she'd been overlooked and underestimated, every moment she'd swallowed her own worth, so Daniel could feel large, all of it had made her into exactly the person Margaret Sullivan needed in that hallway. Her pain had a purpose. It had led her here. Meanwhile, 100 miles away, Daniel Whitmore was building a very different kind of new life. The vote had left him with almost nothing. His shares were gone into the fund. His savings were gone into the clawback. The Beacon Street apartment belonged to the company, which now belonged to Emily, and within a month he'd moved out of it into a small one-bedroom in a part of Boston he'd have sneered at a year earlier. He drove a used car. He cooked his own meals. And for the first time in his adult life, he was not the most important person in any room he walked into, because he no longer walked into rooms where importance was measured. The strange thing was, it didn't destroy him. He'd expected it to. He'd expected the loss of his status, his money, his company to hollow him out completely. And in the first few weeks, it nearly did. He sat in that small apartment, and he felt the absence of everything that had defined him, and there were nights he didn't think he'd survive it. But then something unexpected happened. Marcus Reed called him. "The company kept you on," Marcus said. "You know that. Minor role product advisory, nothing with real authority. Emily's condition. She said you should stay close to the thing you built so you could watch it be run the right way. I always thought that was a strange kind of mercy, half a gift and half a punishment." A pause. "But I'm calling about something else. There's a team in the product division, 6 people. They're struggling. The lead quit, morale's in the ground. They're about to miss a deadline that could cost 40 jobs downstream." Marcus's voice was carefully neutral. "I need someone to go sit with them, not to run them, to help them. No credit, no title, no bonus. Just roll up your sleeves and help 6 frightened people not lose their jobs." A pause. "You interested?" Daniel understood immediately that this was another test. Maybe Emily's test, maybe Marcus's, maybe his own. Help 6 people who couldn't do anything for him in return. No reward attached. The exact thing Emily had asked him if he was capable of that night on the phone. "Yeah," Daniel said, "I'm interested." He spent the next 6 weeks with that team. And a strange thing happened to Daniel Whitmore in those 6 weeks. He discovered that he was good at something he'd never valued. He was good at helping people, not commanding them, not impressing them, not using them, but actually helping them, listening to their fears, unsnarling their problems, staying late to work beside them instead of above them. The team made the deadline. The 40 downstream jobs were saved, and no one outside that small room ever knew Daniel Whitmore had anything to do with it. For the old Daniel, that would have been unbearable, to do something good and get no credit for it. But the new Daniel walked out of that project feeling something he had never once felt in 12 years of running a company. He felt useful. He felt clean. He felt for the first time in his life like a good man, and it had cost him nothing but his pride. And his pride, he was learning, had never been worth what he paid to protect it. He didn't tell Emily. He didn't call her to report. It didn't angle for her approval. That was the difference, and he knew it was the difference. He did it, and he let it be enough that he'd done it, and he asked for nothing in return. But Emily found out anyway. Emily always found out. Marcus told her in a routine update about the product division. He mentioned in passing that Daniel had quietly saved the struggling team and asked for no recognition. And Emily, in her study in Connecticut, listened to this and set down her pen and was quiet for a long time. "He's changing," Alexander observed, watching her face. "Isn't he?" "He's changed," Emily said. "It's already done. He's not becoming someone new. He's become him." She looked out the window. "The man I married all those years ago, the one who cried in my arms, he's back." A pause. "It took losing everything to bring him back, which is exactly what I was afraid of and exactly what I hoped for all at the same time." "Does it change anything between you two?" Emily was quiet. "No," she finally said. "And that's the part people never understand, Alex. Just because someone becomes worthy of love doesn't mean you owe them yours. Daniel becoming a good man is Daniel's redemption. It's not my obligation. I can be genuinely, deeply glad that he found his way back to himself and still never want to share a life with him again. Both things are true. Forgiveness isn't a door you have to walk back through. Sometimes it's just a door you finally get to close gently from the outside." She smiled faintly. "I forgive him. I really do. And I'm never going back. And there's no contradiction in that at all." 8 months after the divorce, they met one more time. It wasn't planned. That was what made it matter. Emily was leaving the Hartford courthouse after another hearing. Another woman helped, and Daniel was coming out of a coffee shop across the street, and they saw each other on the sidewalk in the ordinary afternoon light. Two people who had once shared 12 years in a home and a bed, now strangers with a whole history between them. They stood for a moment, 10 feet apart, and neither of them knew what to say. "Emily," Daniel finally said. "Daniel." She studied him. He looked different. Older, but not in the broken way she'd feared. Older in the way of a man who'd been through something and come out the other side. His expensive clothes were gone. His careful, practiced confidence was gone. What was left was just a man quieter than she'd ever seen him, standing on a sidewalk holding a paper cup of coffee. "I heard about the foundation," he said. "The Carter Foundation. I heard what you're doing." His voice was rough. "It's good work, Emily. It's the best thing I've ever heard of anyone doing. You're saving people's lives." "Thank you," she said simply. Daniel looked down at his coffee. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet. "I never said it right," he said. "That day at the courthouse, all the times I called after, I never said it right because I was always saying it for the wrong reasons. I was sorry because I lost, or sorry because I was scared, or sorry because I wanted something from you." He took a breath. "So let me say it right now when I don't want anything, when there's nothing left for me to gain." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry, Emily. Not for losing you, for not seeing you, for 12 years of having the best person I've ever known sitting right across from me and being too small and too stupid and too full of myself to ever once ask her who she was. You were extraordinary the whole time, and I treated you like furniture. And the shame of that is going to be with me for the rest of my life, and it should be, and I'm not asking you to take it away. I just needed you to hear it said right one time before we go on with our separate lives." Emily felt something loosen in her chest. Some last small knot she hadn't known was still tied. "Thank you, Daniel," she said quietly. "That's the first time you've ever apologized to me without wanting something back." A pause. "It means more than all the others put together. I know it doesn't change anything." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But it heals something. For both of us, I think." She smiled, small and real. "You became him again, the man I married. I heard about the product team. I heard you did it for nothing." Daniel's face colored. "I didn't do it for you to hear about." "I know," Emily said. "That's exactly why it matters." She looked at him for a long moment, this man she'd loved and lost and been destroyed by, and finally, fully forgiven. "Be happy, Daniel. Really. Build a small good life. Help people who can't help you back. Be the man you were always supposed to be." She turned to go, then paused and looked back one last time. And Daniel, thank you for the 12 years. Not all of it was bad. Some of it was the making of me, even the parts that hurt. I wouldn't be who I am now without having been who I was with you. So thank you for that, for accidentally, painfully making me strong enough to become myself. She walked away, and Daniel Whitmore stood on the sidewalk with his coffee going cold in his hand, watching the woman he'd thrown away walk into the ordinary afternoon, and he did not chase her, and he did not call after her, and he did not feel the old desperate need to be forgiven or wanted or important. He just watched her go, and he let her go, and for the first time he was glad, purely glad that she was walking toward a life that was so much bigger and brighter than anything he could have given her. Then he turned and walked the other way, back toward his small apartment and his small, good life, a man who had lost everything he thought he wanted and found in the wreckage the only thing that had ever actually mattered: himself. 100 miles north that evening, Emily Vale sat in the study of the great house and looked at the photographs on her desk. Not photographs of Daniel, photographs of the women. Margaret Sullivan, who now had a job and an apartment of her own, dozens of others, women who'd walked out of courthouses with nothing and been met on the other side by a hand that said, "You matter." Alexander came in and sat across from her. "You look happy," he said. "Actually happy, not the polite kind." "I am," Emily said, and she was almost surprised to hear herself say it. "I saw Daniel today." Alexander went still. And he apologized, really apologized this time, and I forgave him and I meant it and I walked away and I felt nothing but glad. She smiled. "It's over, Alex. All of it. Not just the divorce, the whole thing, the 12 years of being small, the grief, the anger. I set it all down today on a sidewalk in Hartford, and I walked away lighter than I've been since I was a girl." "So what now?" Emily looked at the photographs of the women she'd helped. She thought about Margaret Sullivan's face in that hallway. She thought about all the women still out there, still drowning, still waiting for someone to look at them and think they were worth helping. "Now," she said, "I get to work. There are a lot of women out there who need a jet to show up for them, and I intend to be it for as many of them as I possibly can for the rest of my life." She stood and walked to the window and looked out at the trees her father had planted and felt at last entirely and completely herself. "The quiet wife is gone, Alex. She's not coming back, and I don't miss her at all." Outside, the last light of the day moved gold through the old branches, and inside, a woman who had once been told she was nothing stood tall and certain in the fullness of her own life, no longer waiting, no longer hiding, no longer quiet. Just Emily, finally, completely, unmistakably herself. And it was, she thought, the best thing she had ever become. 1 year to the day after she signed the divorce papers, Emily Vale stood backstage at a business leadership conference in Chicago and listened to a stranger introduce her to 3,000 people. She hadn't wanted to do it. When the invitation first came, she'd said no, and she'd said it fast. She'd spent her whole life avoiding stages, avoiding spotlights, avoiding exactly this kind of attention. She was the quiet one, the one in the back of the room, standing in front of 3,000 people and telling them about the worst year of her life was on the face of it, everything she'd spent 42 years running from. But then she'd thought about Margaret Sullivan. She'd thought about the woman in the Hartford courthouse who'd said nobody's ever offered to help me before. She'd thought about all the women who might be sitting in that Chicago audience or watching the recording later, women who felt exactly the way Emily had felt in that courtroom a year ago, small and discarded, and certain their lives were over. And she'd realized that her silence, the silence she'd worn like armor her whole life, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Because the story that could save those women was hers. And a story does no good locked inside the person who lived it. So she'd said yes. "Are you nervous?" Alexander asked. He'd flown in for it. Of course he had. He stood beside her backstage in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, and he looked at his little sister with an expression she'd been seeing more and more this past year. Pride. Terrified, Emily admitted. "You don't have to do this. You know that. You can walk out the back door right now, and I'll have the jet warm in 20 minutes, and no one will ever say a word about it." Emily smiled. "That's the thing, Alex. A year ago, I'd have taken the jet." She smoothed the front of her dress. It wasn't an expensive dress. She could have worn anything any designer in the world, but she'd chosen something simple, something the old Emily might have worn because she wanted the women in that audience to look at her and see themselves not the fortune. But I'm not that woman anymore. I stopped running a year ago. I'm not going to start again tonight. The stranger at the podium was still talking. Emily half listened as the introduction wound toward its close. "Some of you may have heard the story," the woman was saying to the crowd. "It was in the papers last year, the headline that went around the whole country. They called it the billionaire's jet that took the quiet wife home." A ripple went through the audience, a murmur of recognition. It became this symbol, this fairy tale, the overlooked woman who turned out to be secretly powerful all along. But our speaker tonight told me something backstage that I want you to hear before she comes out. She told me the story everyone remembers is the wrong story. She said the jet never saved anyone. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder of the Carter Foundation, Emily Vail. The applause rose up like a wave, and Emily Vail walked out onto the stage. Her heart was hammering. The lights were hot and bright, and she couldn't see the faces, just a vast dark shape of 3,000 people. And for one paralyzing second, the old fear rose up in her throat and told her to run. Then she gripped the edges of the podium, and she breathed, and she found the thing she'd learned to find over the past year. Not confidence exactly. Purpose. The knowledge that this wasn't about her. It was about the women in the dark who needed to hear what she'd come to say. "A year ago," Emily began, and her voice was quieter than they expected. So quiet that the whole room leaned in to catch it. "I sat in a courtroom in Boston, and my husband of 12 years threw his wedding ring across the floor and told me I was nothing." The room went absolutely silent. "He told me I was dead weight. He told me I'd spent 12 years dragging him down. He told me I should be grateful he was giving me a small apartment and a small check, because a woman like me could never have earned anything on my own." She paused. "And the thing I want you to understand, the thing that matters most about this story, is that for a long time, part of me believed him." She let that sit. Now, some of you know how the story ends. You know that an hour after he called me, a car pulled up outside that courthouse, and my brother stepped out, and it turned out the quiet, worthless wife came from one of the wealthiest families in America. You've heard about the jet. You've heard about the reveal. It's a very satisfying story, isn't it? The arrogant man gets his comeuppance. The secret heiress gets her revenge. Emily shook her head slowly. "But I'm here tonight to tell you that story is a lie. Not the facts. The facts are true. But the meaning is a lie. And the lie is dangerous. And I need you to understand why." She leaned into the light. "Because that story tells you I was saved by the jet. It tells you my worth came from the fortune I'd been hiding. It tells you that the reason I could finally stand up to the man who crushed me was that I turned out to be secretly rich and powerful all along." Her voice sharpened. "And that is exactly backwards. That is the most poisonous possible lesson to take from what happened to me. Because it tells every woman sitting in this room who is not secretly an heiress, every woman who does not have a brother with a jet, that she has no way out. That her worth depends on some rescue that's never coming. That if she isn't secretly powerful, she really is as small as the man in her life keeps telling her she is." Emily gripped the podium. "I'm here to tell you the truth. The jet did not save me. The money did not save me. Do you want to know what actually happened in that courtroom?" She looked out at the darkness. "What happened is that a man screamed at me that I was nothing. And I looked at him, and for the first time in 12 years, I did not believe him. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's the moment everything turned. Not when the car pulled up, not when my brother said my name. The moment that mattered happened entirely inside me in the silence, when I decided that I knew who I was, and he did not get to tell me otherwise anymore." Her voice dropped. "I had that power the whole time, not the money. The money was always there, and it never once made me feel worthy. The power was the decision. The power was choosing to stop believing the man who told me I was small. And that power, that exact power, is available to every single person in this room tonight, and it does not cost $1, and no one can give it to you, and no one can take it away." The applause started somewhere in the back and rolled forward and became a roar, and Emily had to wait for it to subside before she could go on. "I want to tell you about a woman named Margaret," she said when the room was quiet again, and she told them. She told them about the Hartford courthouse, about the woman in the worn coat with no lawyer, about the husband with 2 attorneys, and a woman half his age, about 30 years of a life stripped away in 45 minutes. She told them about the hallway afterward, about the card she'd offered, and about the sentence that had changed the course of her entire life. Nobody's ever offered to help me before. In 30 years, nobody ever looked at me and thought I was worth helping. That's why I built the Carter Foundation, Emily said. Not because I'm generous, not because I'm noble. I built it because I was Margaret. The only difference between me and her was an accident of birth, a family, and a fortune I happened to be able to run back to. And I looked at that difference and I thought that's not fair. It's not fair that my escape existed and hers didn't. It's not fair that I got a jet and she got nothing. So I decided to become the jet, for her and for as many women as I can reach for the rest of my life. She looked out at the crowd. In the past year, the Carter Foundation has helped more than 4,000 women. A murmur went through the room. 4,000 women who walked out of courtrooms with nothing and found someone waiting on the other side. We've provided lawyers so they don't get steamrolled, housing so they're never trapped by a man because they have nowhere else to go, job training, financial education, childcare. We teach women how to never again be in a position where a man controls every dollar and can use that control as a leash. Her voice rose. Because that's the real prison. Not the marriage, the dependence. The moment a woman believes she cannot survive on her own is the moment she becomes a prisoner, and every controlling man in the world knows it, and they build that prison one small cruelty at a time until she forgets she was ever free. The room was electric now. Emily could feel it, 3,000 people leaning toward her, and she understood with something like wonder that the quiet woman who'd spent her whole life unable to command a room had somehow become a person who could hold 3,000 people in the palm of her hand. Not by being loud, by being true. I need to tell you one more thing, Emily said, because I think it's the part that matters most, and it's the part people find hardest to believe. She paused. The man who threw his ring at me, my ex-husband, I did not destroy him. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. I could have, Emily said. I want to be clear about that. When the truth came out, when the whole shape of what he'd done became visible, I held enough in my hands to end him completely, to bury him, to make sure he never worked again, never recovered, spent the rest of his life in the ruins of what he'd built. My brother wanted me to do exactly that. Most people would have. Most people, when they finally get power over someone who hurt them, use it. That's human. That's understandable. She shook her head. But I didn't. And I want to tell you why. Because I think it's the most important lesson in the whole story. More important than the jet. More important than the foundation. More important than any of it. She leaned in. I didn't destroy him because I finally understood that revenge is just another way of letting him control me. Her voice was quiet and fierce. As long as I was busy destroying him, my life would still have been about him. My days would have been organized around his downfall. My happiness would have depended on his suffering. And I realized, standing at the edge of that choice, that I had spent 12 years letting that man be the center of my life, and I was not going to spend the next 12 years doing the same thing, just because now I was the one holding the power. Revenge would have kept him at the center, and I wanted more than I have ever wanted anything to finally make my life about something other than him. The silence in the room was total, so I made a different choice. I protected the innocent people caught in the wreckage, his employees' 200 families who'd done nothing wrong. I gave him the chance to become a better man, not because he deserved it, but because I refused to become someone who took chances away from people. And then I let him go. Completely. I built a life so full and so meaningful that there was simply no room in it for him anymore. She smiled. That's the real revenge, if you want to call it that. Not watching him fall. Becoming someone so complete that his opinion of me became the most irrelevant thing in the world. The best revenge was never his destruction. It was my freedom. The applause that followed did not stop for a long time. When it finally died down, Emily talked for another 20 minutes. She talked about the practical work of the foundation, about how people in the audience could help, about the specific, unglamorous, essential labor of rebuilding a life. And then, as she came to the end, She did something she hadn't planned. She set aside her notes. "I want to close by talking to one specific person," she said. "I don't know if she's in this room. Statistically, she probably is. Maybe more than one of her. I want to talk to the woman out there tonight who is sitting next to a man who makes her feel small." The room went very still. Maybe he doesn't hit you. Maybe there are no bruises anyone could see. Maybe from the outside it looks fine, looks even good, and everyone tells you how lucky you are. But you know. You know because of the way your stomach tightens when you hear his key in the door. You know because you've stopped saying what you think, stopped wanting what you want, stopped being who you are. One small surrender at a time, until you can barely remember the woman you used to be. Emily's voice was gentle, now gentle and absolutely certain. "I know you. I was you. For 12 years I was you, and I need you to hear something from a woman who got to the other side." She looked out into the dark, and though she couldn't see a single face, she spoke as if she were speaking to just one person, because she was. "You are not nothing. Whatever he's told you however many times, however convincingly, it is a lie, and it has always been a lie. Your quietness is not weakness. Your patience is not smallness. The fact that you've survived this long, that you've held yourself together, that you've kept some small ember of yourself alive through everything that is not the resume of a weak woman. That is the strength of a giant." Her voice cracked just slightly, and she let it. "And you do not need a jet. You do not need a secret fortune. You do not need to turn out to be secretly powerful. You already are powerful. The power is the decision to stop believing him. That's the jet. That decision is the jet, and it's been sitting on the runway inside you this whole time, waiting for you to climb aboard." The room had gone completely silent, and in that silence, Emily could hear it here and there throughout the vast, dark space, the sound of women quietly weeping. "Get on the plane," Emily said softly. "It's waiting for you. It always was." She stepped back from the podium. For a moment there was nothing, and then 3,000 people rose to their feet at once, and the sound that filled that room was not just applause, it was something bigger, a roar of recognition, of release of women all over that hall who had heard in the story of a quiet wife from Boston the sound of their own locked doors swinging open. Emily stood in the light and let it wash over her, and she did not shrink from it, and she did not run, and the woman who had spent her entire life hiding in the back of every room stood at the front of the biggest room she'd ever been in and let 3,000 people see exactly who she was. Afterward, backstage, Alexander was waiting. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at his sister, and his eyes were wet, and Emily had never in her life seen her powerful, controlled billionaire brother cry. "Dad would have—" Alexander started, and his voice broke, and he had to stop and start again. "Dad would have given everything he built to see you up there tonight. Everything, Emily. The whole empire. He always said you were the strongest one of all of us. He said it when we were children. He said that girl doesn't need any of this. She's got something none of the rest of you have. And I never understood what he meant. I thought he was being sentimental." Alexander shook his head, wiping his eyes. "I understand now. He saw it. He saw exactly what you'd become. He just didn't live long enough to watch it happen." Emily's eyes filled. "You never told me he said that." "I didn't understand it enough to tell you." Alexander pulled her into an embrace the way he had on the courthouse steps a year ago, and this time she was not a woman being rescued. She was a woman being celebrated. "You did it. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you, and you turned it into a light that's going to guide thousands of women out of the dark. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Most people they carry the wound. They let it define them. They become bitter or broken, or they spend their lives getting even." He held her at arm's length. "You did something almost nobody ever manages to do. You let it make you kind, kinder than you had any right to be. That's not weakness, Emily. My God, that's the strongest thing I've ever seen a human being do." Emily wiped her eyes and laughed a real laugh, full and free. "When did you get so wise, Alex?" "About a year ago," he said. "I had a very good teacher." They flew home that night, and as the jet climbed into the dark over Chicago, Emily looked out the window at the lights of the city falling away below, and she thought about the last time she'd been on this jet a year ago, flying away from a courthouse and a marriage, and a man who'd called her nothing. She'd been so different then. She'd been leaving something behind, running in a way even in her calm. She'd carried a folder full of a man's crimes and a heart full of 12 years of quiet grief, and she hadn't known yet who she was going to become. Now she flew towards something. The difference was everything. Over the months that followed, the Carter Foundation grew beyond anything Emily had imagined. The Chicago speech went out into the world, and it did what stories do when they're true. It traveled. It reached women in small towns and big cities, women in mansions and women in trailers, women who watched it alone at midnight on their phones and felt for the first time in years that someone understood. Donations poured in. Volunteers appeared by the thousands. Other women who'd escaped controlling marriages came forward to help the ones still trapped. The foundation opened offices in 12 cities, then 24. And at the center of all of it was a quiet woman who had learned at last exactly how loud her quiet could be. Emily never remarried. It wasn't a wound. It was a choice, and a happy one. She'd spent 12 years learning that her worth had never depended on a man's presence, and she found to her deep and lasting satisfaction that a life full of purpose and friendship and meaning left very little room for missing what she'd lost. She had the women she helped. She had Alexander closer now than they'd been since childhood. She had, most importantly, herself, fully and finally a woman who woke each morning knowing exactly who she was and needing no one's permission to be it. As for Daniel, their paths crossed now and then in the quiet way of two people who share a history and a city. He stayed at the company in his small advisory role. He never rose again, never rebuilt his fortune, never became important in the way he'd once been so desperate to be. And the strange, quiet miracle of it was that he seemed at last genuinely content. He'd become a mentor to younger employees. He'd become the person people came to when they needed help and expected nothing in return. He'd become in the wreckage of the man he used to be something he'd never been when he had everything. He'd become kind. They spoke once more about 2 years after the divorce. Emily was in Boston for a foundation event, and Daniel came quietly sitting in the back, and afterward he found her. "I read that you turned down a marriage proposal," he said. "Some senator, the papers said." Emily smiled. "The papers say a lot of things." "Was it true?" "It was true." Daniel nodded slowly. "Can I ask why?" Emily considered him this man she'd loved and lost and forgiven, standing in front of her older and softer, and finally fully himself. "Because I spent 40 years learning to be whole on my own, Daniel," she said. "And I'm not going to give that up for anyone, no matter how good the offer. I'm not against love. If it comes and it comes right, wonderful. But I will never again arrange my life around another person's needs. I did that once. It nearly cost me my soul. I got it back, and I'm keeping it." Daniel smiled, and there was no sadness in it, only something like admiration. "That's the healthiest thing I've ever heard anyone say." "I had to learn it the hard way," Emily said. "We both did." They stood there for a moment, two people at the far end of a long story, and Daniel said the last thing he would ever say to her that mattered. "Thank you," he said, "for not destroying me when you could have, for giving me the chance to find out I could be better. I know you didn't do it for me. I know you did it for your own reasons, but it saved my life anyway. The man I am now, the man I actually like being, he only exists because you left the door open when you had every right to slam it shut." He held out his hand. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worth the mercy. I just wanted you to know that." Emily looked at his outstretched hand, and then she took it and shook it one last time, the handshake of two people who had finally completely made their peace. "Be well, Daniel," she said. "Be well, Emily." And that was the last time they ever spoke. Not out of anger, out of completion. There was simply nothing left unsaid, no wound left open, no thread left dangling. The story was finished, and they both knew it, and they walked away from each other into their separate lives with nothing between them but the quiet, settled peace of a thing fully resolved. Years passed. The Carter Foundation became one of the largest women's advocacy organizations in the country. Emily's Chicago speech was watched by millions. The line she'd spoken that decision is the jet became something women said to each other, a kind of code, a reminder passed hand to hand in support groups and shelters and quiet late-night phone calls between friends. "Get on the plane. It's waiting for you." Women who had never heard of Emily Vale used her words to talk each other out of the dark, and that Emily thought was the only monument she'd ever want. Not a building with her name on it. A sentence that saved lives, traveling from mouth to mouth long after anyone remembered where it came from. And sometimes late in the evening, in the study of the great house in Connecticut, Emily would sit by the window and think about the woman she'd been. The quiet wife, the one everyone underestimated, the one who signed the papers without crying and walked out carrying nothing but a folder, certain her life was ending. She'd been so wrong about that. It hadn't been the end. It had been the first true beginning of her entire life. People still talked about that day sometimes. The story had become a kind of legend. They remembered the arrogant husband and the ring thrown across the courtroom. They remembered the black cars and the billionaire brother and the private jet waiting on the runway. They remembered the shocking reveal, the quiet wife who turned out to be a Vale. It made a wonderful story, and people told it the way they told all wonderful stories, focusing on the twist, the reveal, the delicious moment when the man who called her nothing learned exactly how wrong he was. But Emily remembered it differently. She remembered the pen not shaking in her hand. She remembered the strange, quiet calm that had come over her as she signed her name, a calm that had confused everyone, including her. She remembered that the calm hadn't come from knowing about the jet, or the money, or the rescue that was waiting outside. The jet had been a surprise even to her that morning. Her brother had come on his own unasked. No, the calm had come from somewhere deeper and truer than any of that. It had come from a decision she'd made in the silence of that courtroom, a decision that had nothing to do with the Vale fortune and everything to do with the woman she was underneath it. She had decided to stop believing him. That was the whole story. Not the jet, not the money, not the family. Just a quiet woman in a worn gray coat sitting in a courtroom while a man screamed that she was nothing, deciding at long last that he was wrong. Everything else, the foundation, the 4,000 women, the millions who heard her speak, the entire second half of her life, all of it grew from that single seed, from one quiet woman choosing to believe in her own worth when every voice around her told her she had none. The jet had never taken the quiet wife home. The quiet wife had always been home. She'd just forgotten for 12 long years that home was something she carried inside her, and no man could evict her from it, and no fortune was required to furnish it, and the only key that ever fit the lock was the decision to walk through the door. She'd made that decision on a cold morning in Boston alone with nothing, when she had no way of knowing anyone was coming to save her. And that, in the end, was the truth the legend always got wrong. Emily Vale was never saved by a billionaire's jet. Emily Vale saved herself in the silence before the rescue ever arrived. The jet just happened to be there to carry a woman who had already, in the only way that mattered, set herself free. She was never the quiet wife who got rescued. She was the woman who rescued herself and then spent the rest of her life turning around to reach back into the dark and pull other women out. And that is why, long after the jet and the fortune and the arrogant husband were forgotten, her name endured. Not because she was born powerful, because she chose to be. And in choosing, she taught a generation of women that they could choose too. That is the whole story, and it is true. Emily Vale walked into a courtroom as a woman the world called nothing, and she walked out as the truest thing a person can become. Not rescued, not avenged, free. Completely, permanently, magnificently free. And no one ever again got to tell her who she was.